Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Warren. I am the Events and Communications Coordinator at the CIC. And on behalf of everyone at the Catholic Information Center, we just want to welcome Luke. We're so honored to have you here. So welcome, everyone. Kate.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kate Schultz, and it's my honor to introduce our speaker this evening. Luke Burgis is the Director of Programs at the Sioka Center for Principal Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University of America, where he's an associate professor of practice in the Bush School of Business. After a brief career in Wall Street, Luke has been a veteran entrepreneur who has founded multiple companies and a nonprofit organization. He developed the Catholic Entrepreneurship and Design Experience for Catholic University, a program which helps form a spirit of entrepreneurship in Catholic high school students and which is now being taught in nearly 36 schools nationwide. Luke spent 5 years in seminary in the Diocese of Las Vegas, where he studied philosophy and theology, earning an SBT from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. He is the co-author with Dr. Joshua Miller of the book Unrepeatable, Cultivating the Unique Calling of Every Person, and author of the best-selling book Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, which has now been translated into more than 20 languages. And he was the Elio Book, and it was the Elio Book of the Year in 2022, and named one of the top books of the year by the Financial Times. Luke and his wife Claire live in Washington, D.C. Their first baby is on the way. Please welcome Luke Burgis.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Father Charles, and everybody for coming out tonight. I have to say I am exhausted. I've been moving for the last 7 days into a house for our baby, and I'm just coming back from our 19-week doctor's appointment where I got to see our little baby about this big for the first time. So that has really energized me. I'm in a very good mood. It's the most awesome thing I've seen in my life. So that's I'm less tired than I was a few hours ago. So it's good to be with you all. And I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about my book and about somebody that I think really everybody should be aware of, a great thinker, especially Catholics. Just so I understand kind of how much depth to go into, how many people here, who here has actually read my book Wanting so far? A couple, okay. So maybe I will take a step back and give you a bit more detail. My book, Wanting, is about why people want the things that they want. So it's about the genesis, the origin of human desire, and how it's shaped and formed over the course of a life. And this book was inspired by a French Catholic thinker named René Girard, who Bishop Barron said is a modern father of the church, maybe one day a doctor of the church, really important thinker who died just in 2015. Yet many people have never heard of him. So one of my inspirations for writing this book was definitely to help him become better known, and because he deeply affected me and my own story. And I'll tell you a little bit of that tonight. So a bit about me and why I felt compelled to write this book. And I'm going to keep this really high level and as short as I can, because I prefer to make it more interactive and open it up to questions if anybody has any. So we can go into as much detail as you'd like. I graduated from NYU and worked on Wall Street and was very dissatisfied. I knew within the first year that it was not kind of what was going to help me get out of bed every morning, and something that I didn't think I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I left Wall Street, founded a series of companies in my 20s. By the time I was 29, the number was 4 startups from the ground up. A couple did really well, a couple not so well, and one I just became incredibly bored with and walked away from. And when I was 29, I had an extremely powerful conversion experience. I came back to the church, and I recognized it almost immediately, even without knowing what was going on. I knew that it was most of all a conversion of desire, that there was something something at the level of what I wanted that had changed completely. It was almost like the poles on a compass, swap. So it was a true metanoia, a true turning around, but that turning around was really a transformation of my own desires. If you fast forward to many years later, over a decade later, the entire book that I wrote, Wanting, is structured into two parts. Right, the first part is called "The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life." What is mimetic desire, and I'll explain that in a second. And the whole second half of the book is called "The Transformation of Desire." So how are desires transformed? So I knew right away that this was fundamentally a conversion of desire, and that the spiritual life seemed to me to be fundamentally about desire, about what we want, not just a series of rules to follow, but actually wanting the good, the true, and the beautiful. And this seemed like the most important realization of my life. And this is long before I'd ever heard about René Girard or any of these ideas that I wrote about in the book. I immediately decided to take a sabbatical and step away from one of the companies I was running. I happened to be in Las Vegas, Nevada. I moved the last company that I'd started from Southern California to Vegas for a couple of reasons. One, for purely business reasons, tax reasons, rent, wages, all of those. And because at the time I really liked to play poker a lot. So I thought that this was the best of both worlds. It was a good business decision and I could have some fun. So moved to Vegas, and within 3 months of moving there, I just got sort of smacked over the head with this powerful conversion experience. I was literally going into the desert in Vegas, and I didn't realize that I was going into a spiritual desert while I was there too. And I realized it was so important that I needed to step away from my company. And this had happened after a series of really kind of incredible events that really woke me up to how disordered my own kind of striving had been, and the nature of my own desires, through some relatively traumatic experiences, thinking I was going to sell my company one day, and then waking up the next day and having a call from the board telling me that the deal was completely off. Things like this started to happen and got me really questioning, if that deal had went through, would I have been happy? Like, what would I have wanted then? Would I have just started another company? And I found myself kind of caught in this treadmill, and I knew that I needed to somehow get off of it. So I totally stepped away. Uh, Make a really long story short, that stepping away, I traveled, eventually led me to seminary, where I was discerning the priesthood very seriously for 5 years. And I did a couple of years in California, and then I was in Rome for a few years studying philosophy and theology. And every year in seminary, you're required to go on a spiritual retreat, a silent retreat every year that I was in seminary, at least. And usually between 5 to 7 days of silence, the whole class goes. For those of you that have been on a silent retreat, this one was not really an Ignatian silent retreat, but you would meet with your spiritual director once a day for about a half hour, and the rest of it was totally silent. And I'm telling you this story because this is where I came into contact with this thinker that kind of explained to me almost everything about my life up to that point, that I didn't quite understand what was happening, the machinations of my own desires. And it happened like this. The first day of the silent retreat, I met with with my spiritual director. He asked me how things were going, and then he assigned me a reading for the day. And it was a reading from scriptures from John chapter 8. And this is the reading of the woman caught in adultery who was about to be stoned. And Jesus intervenes in the stoning and reverses this process completely. So he asked me to go back and meditate on that for the next day. And we meet up again the next day and we talk about it. And, he asked me basic questions. Who did you identify with most in the story? What do you think is going on here? What came up in your prayer? Just very basic questions. And then he sent me back that day he said, go, please meditate on the same thing again. And this happened the next day as well. So I kept getting sent back with the same reading. And we would have a slightly different discussion about it every day. And I started to get frustrated because on the 5th day of the retreat, I wasn't able to move on. And I started to cheat a little bit and talk to some of my classmates. It's like, hey, is he giving you the same thing to read every day? You know? And it turns out they weren't. Everybody was getting different things to meditate. I was like, I feel like maybe I'm stuck here. Maybe there's something that I'm not quite getting. Have you ever seen like an old classical kung fu movie? There's kind of the trope of, the kid who makes it to the top of the mountain and asks the master, how can I be your student? And then he gives him a task and he goes and he keeps trying to do it. And then every time he goes back, he's real happy, he thinks that he did it the right way, and then he's sent back down the mountain and has to start over again from scratch. And that's exactly how I felt. And it really wasn't until the last day of this retreat that we had he sort of opened up the scripture to me using the ideas of René Girard, who inspired wanting. And I began to see all kinds of things that are happening in that passage. One, there, it says something about sort of structural sin would be one way to put it. There are people that are caught up in a mimetic or imitative process without even knowing it. So, the saying, the first stone, or he who cast the first stone, is incredibly powerful, embedded in our culture. Almost everybody has heard that phrase at some point. But what is so special about the first stone? René Girard asks. And he answers, and this kind of forms the whole basis of his theory, mimetic theory. He says the first stone is the only stone that doesn't have a model to follow. It's the only stone that doesn't have a model. And that's why casting it is often so hard. The second stone has one, the third stone has two, and so on and so forth. They get easier and easier to throw once this process has been kicked off. And once you're in the middle of that process, it's incredibly difficult to extract yourself from it. There's also the issue of, in the passage, I was very, very much focused on, she's caught in the act of adultery, she's guilty, then there's the law, and, should the law be enforced? Well, no, they're not thinking about mercy, and how does grace come in, and what did Jesus actually do here to stop this stoning? We don't typically call that particular gospel passage a miracle, right? In the way that we do the changing of water into wine, but one could make the case that there was a miracle intervention that happened there on some level. It wasn't purely human, because on a purely human level, it should have happened, right? It seemed like they were ready to carry out this act. So, and Girard would say that was a quintessential example. A stoning is an example of what he calls the scapegoat mechanism that humans have used throughout history to purge transgressors or threats, right, from their community. Something that we still engage in today. It just comes in different forms. Most places in the world, we're not ritually stoning people physically, but we have other ways to do this. Even what ways that sound relatively trivial, like online. So this was my introduction to René Girard, and he told me that day, I think it would do you well, Luke, to read a little bit more about this thinker that I found really interesting. I think he might help you understand some of kind of what's going on, both here in the seminary and in your own life, and some of the struggles that you're dealing with. And he introduced me to René Girard, and I very quickly devoured everything that I could get my hands on that Girard had ever written. And I realized about halfway through the first book that, first of all, I'd needed to read it about 5 times before I really understood what he was talking about. And before it actually became really personal, until I understood it on a personal existential level. I understood it on an intellectual level at first, and it took me years, quite frankly, before I understood the ways in which I myself was highly mimetic in negative ways too. Let me take a step back before I explain the basics of René Girard's theory and why I found it so fascinating, and tell you a little bit about who he is. Because my book has a little bit of biographical detail, but not a lot. The man himself was think sort of exemplified his theory in many ways. He's a Frenchman who came to the U.S. shortly after World War II. He was a professor. He had studied history, but he was an extremely interdisciplinary thinker. So he spent the late 40s and most of the 50s reading everything he could get his hands on, from philosophy to theology to literature, and he was accepting any kind of work that he could. So if as a young professor, if he was asked to teach a literature class, he would teach it. If he was asked to teach other subjects, he would just throw himself into the work. And this seemed to form an interdisciplinary mind in him. He's probably born with one, but he certainly accepted everything that came to him. And that's probably one of the reasons he developed a theory that is so comprehensive, that covers so much of human life. He called himself early on by the provocative name of a political atheist. He saw most of politics as being mimetic rivalries and zero-sum games, and he wanted to extract himself for that. It's a very interesting thinker that always coined these really interesting turns of phrases. And by political atheist, just so everybody's clear, he didn't mean politics founded on atheism. He meant a stance of not believing in political idols is what he meant by that phrase. And we could have a whole discussion about that. And he also had a pretty good sense of humor. So by the end of his career, he spent the last couple of decades of his life at Stanford University. He had some very famous students at Stanford that are why we know him today. And he was inducted into the Académie Française in 2005. It's the most kind of prestigious honor that a Frenchman can have. And while he was there, he kind of laughed at the costumes that he was wearing for the ceremony, and thought it would be amusing to get some of the Academy letterhead out of the drawer in his preparation room and write all of his friends little funny notes to commemorate the day. He was very honored, but he definitely had a sense of humor. His set of ideas, they're a set of ideas is the best way to explain it, that are all interrelated, and I'm just going to name them and just very briefly just kind of define them and how they're related to one another. And if you have questions about them, we can go a lot further into them. But he wrote a lot of books about them, and they're fairly complex. But his core idea is mimetic desire. This is the kernel of his entire theory. It's an idea that he said came together for him on a train ride in 1959. It's very strange. He describes having the insight of mimetic desire as an almost mystical experience. He used the phrase, "everything came to me at once." He goes, I had this extremely dense, singular insight into human nature. It wasn't anything new necessarily. He said, it was all kind of in the Gospels. He goes, but it just, on an anthropological level, I had this insight that I knew was so important that I was going to spend the rest of my life exploring and investigating, and he did. And it was mimetic desire. And at its most basic level, it's the idea that human beings are imitative creatures. As Aristotle said, we're the most imitative creatures in the world. But we don't just imitate surface level things like clothes and speaking language. I mean, imitation is the basis of all of education. It's how we learn anything at all. But it goes down to the very level of our desires. So Girard said that this idea that our desires are created ex nihilo, that we invent all of our own desires out of nothing, is a lie. He called that the romantic lie, and said that modern individualism is a very formidable lie that most people believe in. He said, in fact, our desires are shaped, they're generated for us in positive ways and in negative ways. From almost the first moments that we're born, we're imitating. I know that when my little girl is born in October, God willing, she's going to look into her mother's eyes, one of the first things that she's going to do. And her mother and me will be her very first models. And babies do something extraordinary called gaze following from the first 30 minutes that they're born. They actually follow the gaze of their parents. And they'll only do this with humans, by the way. They've tested this with robots and with animals. They somehow recognize that we are like them, that we're the same, and enter into this. They commune with us spiritually. So there's this tremendous and beautiful world openness that humans have, an openness to commune with other people, and to follow them and to be affected by them in some way. So immediately when a baby looks into her mother's eyes and sees the mother looking at some third object, the baby naturally takes an interest in that third object. Oh, mom is interested in this object, and they instinctually follow the mother's gaze. So this happens pretty much as soon as children come out of the womb. And Girard saw that this happens in more and more sophisticated ways as we grow and get older. So we're not just looking at things and regarding things that other people are regarding on a surface level. This begins to happen even at the level of desire. And mimetic desire very simply means imitative desire, that we're unconsciously or subconsciously imitating the desires of other people, usually without understanding that we're doing it. Again, in positive ways and in ways that can lead to conflict. So in positive ways, if somebody is around somebody who deeply desires holiness, trying to live a life of virtue, they somehow can spiritually commune with the desires of that other person and be infected with them in a positive way. And how often have we seen somebody who does some beautiful act of charity or desires something that we would like to desire, and maybe we don't right now as much as we would like to, and we want to be positively infected by that desire. So desires are contagious is one way that Girard would say it. But this can also be very negative, right? It can be very negative when you see the way that desires are contagious today online, right? Anger spreads very quickly. The desire to accuse, the desire to punish, vice, desires for certain lifestyles, desires for even one's relationship to the church. Right? This is something that is mediated from a very young age, and our desires to be in communion with the church or not are very much, oftentimes, a product of mimetic desire, or at least affected by it. So Girard is certainly not saying that we're not free to choose and that we don't have intentionality, but he's saying that we're profoundly affected by the people that we're around, real and fictional. It's one of the reasons why literature is so important and education. One of Girard's favorite books was Don Quixote by Cervantes. And he laughs. And he says, well, how does that book start? It starts with him reading a book about a gallant knight and being inflamed with the desire to be like that knight. The whole plot line of that book is driven by Don Quixote's mimetic desire. And we're often like that too. Things that we see on TV, voices that we hear. And today, with the internet, we have a lot more models of desire than ever before. I grew up, I'm mostly a product of the 80s and 90s, before social media. So my models of desire were mostly limited to my little town in West Michigan and the high school that I went to. And I had some strong models there, but I wasn't necessarily exposed to millions on a daily basis, or the possibility of millions on a daily basis. Girard quickly saw that this phenomenon of mimetic desire, which is present in the first pages of Scripture, by the way, if you think of, the story of in the garden, where did this desire to eat the forbidden fruit come from? Well, it was suggested. It didn't come out of thin air. It was suggested by a third person or a third party. So this suggested desire is another way to think of the way that desires are mediated to us. Shakespeare is full of suggested desires. Girard loved Shakespeare because he actually wrote an entire book on Shakespeare and how mimetic desire works in his plays, called the theater of envy. So you think of a character like Iago, who is constantly suggesting things to other characters, and he is a mediator in the middle of all of the action. The two gentlemen of Verona, they're reinforcing one another's desire for the same woman. His comedies and his tragedies are very often driven by this kind of mimesis. So Girard saw that this can become can lead to conflict and become conflictual when two people take each other as mutual models of desire. So you could think of siblings that are kind of caught in a sibling rivalry, for instance, rival friends, people that are in rivalries at companies. Uh, and by the way, there are 5 stories of sibling rivalry in the book of Genesis alone. So, Girard noticed this, and he said, well, why is it that, it's siblings that are often in rivalry? And actually, almost every other culture in the world has some story about twins that end up fighting. So what's the underlying truth here? And he realized that, we're actually, we tend to make people rivals who are, that we have more in common with, who are more similar to us. And Girard starts out one of his books. My favorite book of Girard's actually called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. It's the most theological of all of Girard's books. I highly recommend it as a starting place if you'd like to learn more. He starts that book out with just a profound look at the 10 Commandments, and specifically the last commandment, which the last 3 commandments, in fact, keep talking about the neighbor, right? The neighbor, the neighbor, the neighbor. The word is used repeatedly. So he says, well, what's curious or what's specific about the neighbor? Well, if the neighbor is the one who's in closest proximity to us, the one that we're most likely to have a little bit more in common with, as opposed to somebody who lives, in a different city or in a different country, or who's practices a different religion. And then the very last commandment seems to prohibit all of this negative mimetic desire, the kind that leads to rivalry. The scriptures use the word, it's often translated as covet. Do not covet all of these things that your neighbor has. The Hebrew word there is really a word that kind of just means desire. Do not desire these things. And Girard sort of sees in that negative mimetic desire, right? Not the kind that can be positive, but the kind that leads to rivalry and conflict. And the final step, so Girard sees that these negative, these rivalrous desires can be contagious. They can really spread throughout a community, lead to what he calls a crisis of undifferentiation. We tend to become like that which we imitate. So there's a strange paradox. Be careful who you make your enemies, because you will become like them, because you're paying attention to them all the time, right? So this mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry tends to exacerbate this crisis of undifferentiation. And eventually, Girard sees this leading to serious conflict and to violence, and specifically the scapegoat mechanism, where people turn on somebody who's caught the attention of the community or the group. They're united, and they reintroduce difference into the group by finding a scapegoat, and often engaging in either collective violence against the scapegoat, expelling the scapegoat. And of course, there's a very famous passage of the scapegoat ritual in the book of Exodus, right, where the high priest in Israel on every year on Yom Kippur brings the whole community together. There are 2 goats. One of the goats is sacrificed to God in the temple, and the other goat is chosen to be the scapegoat. And all of the sins of the people are ritually transferred onto this scapegoat, and the scapegoat is driven into the wilderness to a demon that lives in the wilderness. And this produces catharsis, sense that their sins have been purged. And Girard sees this as kind of a model. Of course, it's where the word scapegoat comes from one of the translations of that passage in the 16th century. And Girard sees this as a model for what we very often still do today, right? We still do it in highly ritualized ways often. It's just more and more hidden, right? We engage in this process in very hidden ways. So the scapegoat mechanism is one reason I think understanding the way that we get to that point before we're at that point is one of the reasons I think Girard is in some ways is prophetic, and he's important to understand in the world that we live in today, where the scapegoat mechanism keeps kind of morphing and taking on new forms. So there's I'm going to wrap up here shortly because I'd like to have some time for discussion. But there's a few things that I think are really important, or reasons why Girard's thought is important in the world that we live in, and ways that Girard's thought can be developed. So one of those is spiritual theology, right? So the role of desire in the spiritual life. In some sense, the spiritual life is about the conversion of desire. So Girard would write that, when Christ says to imitate him, he does not mean to imitate the way that he dressed or his exact actions. He fundamentally means to follow him and imitate him at the level of his desire, right? Which is a complete self-emptying love for the Father, right? That was his desire. And the saints are great models of desire. So, imitating the saints is at the most profound level is an imitation of desire. And there's something that's very common to the desires, right? It's the love of God and neighbor, not the external things. So desire is really foundational in the spiritual life. Number two, this is the role of imitation in human life is important in a world dominated as it is by technology and specifically AI. The psalm comes to mind. I think it's Psalm 115. Really important. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. They make no sound in their throats. Those who make them are like them, and so are all who trust in them. Those are pretty haunting words in some sense. We become like that. We become formed by that which we imitate. And in some sense, we're almost imitating computational and calculating ways of thinking. Certainly, Marshall McLuhan would agree with that, in the sense that it's actually forming our humanity. That technology is never neutral. Both Girard and McLuhan would agree with that statement. It's always forming us. So we've got to think seriously about what we're imitating in the world of technology that we live in. When it comes to markets, consumerism, business, I'm a professor of business at Catholic University, so I think of business through the lens of Girard very often and sort of teach a different way of looking at business and how the decisions that we're making are affecting people at the level of desire. Whether it's a regulation, a decision that a leader makes, that leader could be a pastor of a parish, or it could be the CEO of a company. How is that person's leadership affecting people at the level of desire? Laws often affect people's desire. There's a really very strange thing that happens where laws as obstacles can actually increase the desire for the very thing that they prohibit. There's all kinds of interesting views that Girard has on decision making that are many of them counterintuitive, and looking at the way that businesses have a role in shaping desire is critical. I've been an entrepreneur for most of my life, starting businesses, and it wasn't until my third try at it that I started realizing this almost sacred responsibility that any parent realizes that they have, that I'm thinking about a lot these days with a child on the way, that in some sense, I can't stay neutral. right? I can't just create things and not think about how this is affecting what people want, for better or for worse. And then lastly, this Girard was sort of saw these mimetic processes unfolding throughout history. He was very historical. In fact, his study, his PhD, was in history. So he's very historical. And sort of seeing the way that mimesis is played out in history fascinated him, and I think helped him read the signs of the times. Right? He was an avid follower of the news. He was reading about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, and saw this very much through the lens of mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. And we wonder today, how might an understanding of Girard's work help us to understand when we're engaging in unhealthy, destructive, dangerous mimetic processes in our culture, just like the woman caught in adultery and who was about to be stoned in the Gospels. Two final things. One, this is the 100th anniversary of René Girard's birth, so this is a very big year for Girard. It's one of the reasons I'm here giving this talk. This desire was completely mediated to me by a good friend who said you should get down to the CIC. This is an important year for René Girard. So I've spent the last 4 months organizing a conference that I'd like to invite you all to if you're in DC in October. I apologize, I had to move the date. It's now November 3rd. I had to move the date because of the baby. November 3rd, I am hosting a conference at Catholic University called the Novitate Conference. Novitate comes from the Latin word meaning newness or renewal. And it's all about Girard. And it's going to look at Girard's life and explore his ideas. And we're going to have roughly 200 people are going to be there looking at what Girard has to say about everything from economics to politics to education, right? The role of mimetic desire in education, business, the spiritual life. It's going to be a really, really interesting gathering, and I'd invite anybody to apply to attend if you would like. So I wrote my book with the hope that it would simply be a conversation starter. That more people would just become aware of these ideas and of Girard. And this gathering in November is one small way, I think, certainly to celebrate his life. We're going to have a dinner banquet just a couple of blocks from here, actually, at the Mayflower Hotel that evening, and celebrate his life. But I also really hope that it's an opportunity to just bring a lot of people together with different perspectives and different domain expertise, and talk about these ideas. And hopefully a book will emerge from that conference sometime next year. So I want to close with this. The name of that gathering is, the theme for the gathering in November is Be Not Conformed, which is inspired by the words of Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where Paul writes, "Don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds." So conformity is a concept that I've been fascinated with ever since I first learned about Girard. Girard is certainly not saying, the goal in life is to be a contrarian and, never conform to anything at all. That's certainly not the Christian understanding. The Christian life has a shape and a form to it. And I'd say that form is the form of the cross, right, and the life in Christ. But so there's different kinds of conformity. And Paul is saying, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. In other words, don't allow your mimetic desires to be on the horizontal plane, to be dominated, just going from one thing to the next on the horizontal plane. I spent my 20s engaged in that form of conformity, trying to conform myself to, the kind of entrepreneur that made it into Entrepreneur Magazine or something like that, right? That's not a fulfilling thing to try to spend that much time and energy to conform your life to. And we all have kind of these horizontal things that from time to time we're pulled into conformity in those directions. But to find a sort of a different principle of change and conversion. And I'm these beautiful words by Josef Svarina, who was a Czech theologian, wrote this about that passage, and it's why I chose to sort of name this entire gathering after that scripture verse. Svarina read that, and he says, "Do not conform!" Exclamation mark. Do not conform. Me schematizeste. So the Greek is, do not be schematized. Do not be schematized, right? So he's saying there are these schemes, these worldly schemes or patterns, and do not conform to them. And it's interesting that the Greek word is what the word scheme comes from. He says how well this expression reveals the perennial root of that verb schema. In a nutshell, all schemas, all schemes, all exterior models in this world are empty. We have to want more. The apostle makes it our duty. Change your way of thinking, reshape your minds. And in the Greek, it's metamorphosis. Paul's Greek is so expressive and concrete. He opposes schema or scheme, permanent form, to metamorphe or metamorphosis, change in the creature. So an internal principle of change, right? We could call that grace or intimate mediation. One is not to change according to any model, which in any case is always out of fashion, but it is a total newness with all of its wealth. A total newness with all of its wealth. And newness there, be transformed by the newness of your senses, is how the Vulgate translates it. That's where this word novitate comes from, right? Just total newness. So I hope this served as a small introduction to Girard. I hope I see some of you in November. If you're interested in that, novitateconference.org is where you can learn more about the gathering and apply to attend. And with that, I'd love to open the floor to any questions. Yes, sir.
What philosophers influenced Girard? I mean, he doesn't come out of nowhere. What was his scholastic background? What was his principal influence in Europe?
Yeah, he was very much influenced by the sort of French existential philosophy of his day. So Sartre was a huge influence on Girard, and he actually one of the core concepts in Girard is the idea of metaphysical desire. That at its root, all desire is really metaphysical desire or a desire for being. So in his early life, he was influenced by Sartre, Derrida. Everybody who was kind of popular at the time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But he went through a process of maturation. He had a very serious conversion. He became Catholic in 1959. His thought changed after that. He entered into a lifelong correspondence with Jesuit Father Raymond Schwager in Austria at the University of Innsbruck. That profoundly shaped his thought. Then he dove into the scholastics. His thought has never really been couched in scholastic philosophy. That's one of the things I hope we get to do a little bit of in November when everybody comes together. I'm sort of asking anybody that wants to put Girard in dialogue with Thomas Aquinas to please write a paper. I would love to read that. Yes. By him? The first one that comes to mind is Bishop Barron. So René Girard is one of Bishop Barron's intellectual heroes, and I know is working hard to I think hopefully Bishop will be able to make it in November too. That's how important Girard is to him, and a lot of priests that I know have been influenced, but maybe not names that you would recognize. Yes. Thank you. Mhm. It's a great question, thank you. Because one of the, I wouldn't necessarily say a criticism of Girard, but some people, when they're first introduced to this thought, it can sound a bit fatalistic or deterministic, right? Am I just this mimetic creature who, can only imitate other people and sort of determined by my environment and determined by the models that I have around me? I don't read Girard as saying that. I mean, certainly we have a sense of agency and intentionality in the models that we can choose to be around. Um, there's also all kinds of things that affect us, so it's much more complex than that. I mean, if we want to bring in the spiritual life, there's a life of grace, which is kind of unmediated sometimes. Um, all kinds of things that can happen in prayer, for instance. Um, it, I think with breaking the negative cycles is the whole. That's what John 8 is all about, right? With the stoning, and it's incredibly difficult to do without any model whatsoever, right? When you're completely alone and you don't even have any models to follow. I think my personal view on this, I don't know if Girard has ever put it this way, is that that basically requires some kind of supernatural aid or grace to be able to break out of that. And that there is a type of life that can be lived where our freedom can be won or lost. We can become more or less free based on our actions. And I do think it's possible to lose a large degree of agency based on our choices. Right? It's kind of what addiction is all about. Um, but in general, right, Girard would say, we're certainly not slaves to mimesis in any way whatsoever. Yeah.
Hinted at it at a couple of points in your talk, but I wonder if you could speak further models and mimetic instances in business leadership, and either for good or bad, and maybe how it affected your own leadership in business.
Sure. Um, so I've been affected by positive and negative models in business. There is a certain culture in. I kind of came up in the Silicon Valley culture, where it's funny. Like everybody kind of dresses the same and talks about the same things and um, competes for the same accolades. And I realize that is sort of seems like a very silly thing. Like we're not actually we're more concerned about the valuation of our companies than about creating real human value in the world. And there is such a thing as a company that can have a subjective valuation of tens of hundreds of millions of dollars that just goes out of business over the next year because there was kind of a flash valuation created. Everybody gets out and goes their own ways, and is set. And there's a certain gamification that I saw happening with that, and it was um, very enticing, right? It's very tempting to sort of get caught into that. Let me just make as much money as possible so that I can, have these illusions of grandeur where I'll be, this great philanthropist for the rest of my life. It's kind of the Sam Bankman-Fried trap, right? Effective altruism, right? It's very much a culture that exists. Um, and that I had a very hard time finding positive models of desire in that world in the early 2000s where I was starting these companies through really the whole 2000s. And I realized I needed different models. And some of the people that are doing the most amazing things in business, starting wonderful companies, things that serve human dignity, they don't make they don't get written up in the Wall Street Journal. They don't go viral on Twitter. These are people are often leading a hidden life. Uh, Art Sioka, who is the benefactor of the Sioka Center for Principled Entrepreneurship, I probably wouldn't be part of it if he hadn't been a tremendous inspiration. Right? He made decisions that were the right thing to do, that cost him a lot of money, but they were ethical. There's a Catholic entrepreneur who had a family member have a stay in a hospital, and he remembered this family member saying how undignified he felt wearing the hospital gowns. And this guy actually was so frustrated by that sort of indignity that his family member felt, that he started a company to make better hospital gowns and said, well, no, actually, this does matter, right? This is important, and there happens to be a huge market for it. But the whole business was sort of centered around something that was around human dignity. So these people inspire me, and I realize that they're all over the place. They're just not as we could say mimetically popular. They're a little bit harder to find, but I've been lucky to find quite a few of them in my life. Yes.
So in the book, you have a few lovely, entertaining models of, positive models of desire. But can you think of any, I guess, positive models of desire, public figures in American culture? Say,
Um, I I really hesitate to name any person because I worry that they're it's just very easy to idolize people that way, right? And it's always kind of it's really complicated to single out individual people, right? And again, it goes back to the last question. Um, Most of the models of desire that are really important to me or that have affected me throughout my life are people that I think are hidden saints, right? They're people that I've had personal interactions with, and um, I I haven't had many interactions with public figures, you know. So in some sense, the reality of their life is completely mediated to me by the news and what I see, and a persona and perception that is more or less real. So I'm very hesitant to call out people by name. Yeah.
Just a question, like, do you have some suggestions to read about how the topic of your book, like the mimetic
hmm
and the internet related, like, how it is?
Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of a good. There's a chapter in Wanting that does address it. Um, and the point that I make is that the internet and specifically social media has just multiplied the number of models of desire that we have, and it's really increased the speed at which desire moves. And there's institutions that are doing a lot of work in talking about the dangers of social media, especially for young children, right, that have smartphones sometimes at 8, 9, 10 years old. But they're only analyzing this on a kind of a neurological level, and not on the level of desire. So, Girard speaks about desire in a way that's very spiritual, and I think it's important. Um, so Cal Newport's doing. I think he writes good stuff on this with related to deep work. And there is a sense in which the setting of boundaries and not inadvertently exposing ourselves to. I mean, it requires some amount of humility, knowing that we can't just expose ourselves to every model of desire under the sun and expect not to go a little crazy. I mean, I kind of one way to think of desire is kind of like I teach a class at Catholic University where we open the class and we explain to the students how a compass works, right? And most of them don't have any idea how a compass actually works. But the point of the class, called the Vocation of Business, is to try to help them understand kind of where they want their compass to point, and really where do they want their desires to point? What do they want? And as most of you in this room probably know, and there's a compass can have a lot of false norths. If it's next to an electronic device or anything like that, the needle will point in the wrong direction and make you think it's north when it's not. And I think negative models result in what Girard would call deviated desire. So our desires are deviated from the true north. I just wish I had a specific book off the top of my head, but I'm not sure if I do. But I gave it a shot in Wanting. Yes,
My question is a bit related to the last one. I read that Girard passed away in 2015.
correct.
Did he actually manage to analyze the
He didn't, because he did pass away in 2015. But the last 6 or 7 years of his life, he died at 91, and he was in decline. So he was sort of just missed social media. So he never wrote anything about social media. But some of his students did. Probably his most well-known student is Peter Thiel, who's a co-founder of PayPal, and investor in Facebook. And he says that because of his teachings, the teachings of Girard, when he saw Facebook, he saw that it was a mimetic machine, for better or worse. I mean, the whole company really ran on social media, and he realized that it was an engine of mimetic desire. And it's interesting. One of the ways, and not a lot of people know this, but um, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, they introduced it very meticulously and slowly on specific campuses of Ivy League universities, starting at Harvard, and then they just one by one moved it to other Ivy League universities. And then NYU, while I was an undergrad, was one of the first other universities they introduced it to. So I was on it, like at one of the earliest stages, and they would measure how quickly it spread, from being introduced on campus to having like a 90% adoption rate. And the numbers are just incredible. It's like less than 2 months. Like, just they introduce it and everybody on campus is using it, because of the mimesis. I mean, that's the way that it works, right? Through imitation. And there's probably a little bit of FOMO, fear of missing out, involved in there as well. But that was a real, the numbers don't lie, and that was a sign. And it goes to the neighbors thing that we talked about earlier, right? The neighbors are always the most important. So I bring that up because everybody on your campus you have a lot in common with. They're your literal neighbors. And that's why the mimesis seemed to work so well, the way that they rolled it out. Maybe it wouldn't have been the same if they just released it, and then you're getting people on your feed that live in a different country or that don't go to your school. You're probably not going to be as interested in them as you would if they went to your school and they're in your class. So there's something tremendously powerful about the similarity and the way that we're interested in those kinds of models as opposed to others. I think we're pretty much at time. Maybe one more if anybody. Great. Well, I understand there's a reception following, so thank you all very much for coming out. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke, for calling us all higher to desire something more than maybe the way we're living now. So following this until 8 o'clock, we have wine and some snacks. So please help yourself. And we'll have his book for sale, and he'll be signing books as well. So stop by and buy one of his books. Thank you.